first question I've got before we get into the past of everything, how are you spending your time right now?
Spending time with my family, and it's a wonderful thing. Being away from them so often as a member of Congress was one of the most difficult parts of the job, if not the most difficult. And it's good to be home. It's good to see my kids. It's good to, you know, just see them growing up. And that's something you miss as a member of Congress, especially when you're there for 10 years like I was.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I do want to get into a little bit of how you're looking at things now. Compare, if you could, the Republican Party from when you came into Congress in 2011 to what it's like today.
It's totally different. When I came in 2011, there was obviously this political establishment that had been there for a while, and there was a Tea Party group of representatives who were coming in and cared about fiscal conservatism and limited government, economic freedom, individual liberty, and were passionate about those issues. But what we have today is a party that is totally unhinged. I mean, it's not even about policies anymore. Like, we actually came in with policy ideas and we tried to implement those policy ideas. You've got new members of Congress who are coming in, and it's mostly just political theater. They're just acting for television. I don't think they have particular legislative priorities. I don't think they care much about conservatism or libertarianism or any other ism. They're not even thinking about how to best represent their constituents. It's just about playing a game, acting for the television so they can get on Fox News at night or MSNBC at night or CNN at night. And that's really disheartening.
I want to touch on that theatricality a little bit more. I've got something on that in a little bit I want to get to. I want to ask kind of the same question about the Democratic Party now. It's obvious from someone outside looking in, but is the
Mhm.
Democratic Party any different than it was 10 years ago when you first went into office?
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party has moved to the left compared to when I was first running for Congress. And this is something you see. Both parties have moved toward the extremes. You don't have as many people in the center anymore. That doesn't mean that you can't be a strong progressive or a strong conservative, and that you have to be an extremist if you're a strong progressive or a strong conservative. You can be a strong progressive and strong conservative and be in the center in terms of how you conduct yourself. And there's not as much of that anymore. The rhetoric is overcharged. It's hyper. It's wild. And I think the Republican Party is really in a worse place right now. But that's not to say that the Democratic Party has been improving over the past several years. I think that they have been moving in the wrong direction too. And this is a real problem for our country, that you have two parties that are moving toward the extremes, toward hyperpolarization. And we really need to get back toward working together. That doesn't mean, again, bringing in all the same ideas. We want people to come in with strong views, strong principles, very different ideas. That's great for our country that people come in with different ideas. But we should be actually debating those things and discussing those things and legislating on those things, instead of just going to the TV and calling the other people evil or liars or bigots or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I think you'd probably agree this has been a move, like they've been moving further apart for a generation or more now.
Yes.
I think. Okay, when you left the party, when you left the Republican Party, you were first an independent. Now you consider yourself, you're a registered libertarian. Successes for third parties in this country are few and far between as we look historically. Realistically, do you see a third party ever gaining traction, and how would that have to happen?
Yes, I do see it gaining traction, and I think it can gain traction with the Libertarian Party, which is why I became a member of the Libertarian Party. Again, in Michigan, we don't really have party registration, although people will say, you're registered or whatever. But I ran an exploratory campaign as a Libertarian candidate for president. I didn't continue that campaign. I decided not to go forward with it. But I do think that the Libertarian Party offers a venue for people who care about the things I care about, and who care about also being sensible and being reasonable and being rational. A lot of times, third parties get, you know, blamed for being extreme or radical, and I think that what you see is the two old parties right now are the extreme radical parties, and and it's the third parties that are coming in more on ideas and trying to change the dynamic, and it's the old parties that are extreme and radical.
Yeah, when having a welcoming ideology to a lot of people, or even having the two major parties being people being tired of them, is one thing. But without infrastructure, without money, how
Mhm.
would a third party legitimately compete?
Well, you need those things. And you have to build up a third party if you're going to compete. And that's what I'm trying to do with the Libertarian Party. I think that there are a lot of disaffected Republicans who would be interested in a strong third party. Now, we have to make sure that it is a welcoming place, that it is a place that they think is viable for politics. Nobody wants to join a party that they don't think is viable. So we have to make sure it appears viable by working hard to build that infrastructure. And that's what I'm working on right now. It's about having the right leadership team in place. And I can tell you that I think the Libertarian Party leadership team is a lot better than the Republican Party leadership team. I don't think it's a close call. I don't know as much about the Democratic Party leadership team, but I can tell you, compared to the Republican Party leadership team, there's no comparison. I mean, it's more professional. It's a better leadership team. They're more on top of things, and I think they're more in control of the party's brand in a sense than the Republican Party, who's just sort of let it devolve into a nothingness.
You mentioned a moment ago, you referenced your brief presidential exploratory committee. Why did that not move forward? Was that due mostly in part to the pandemic?
That was a large part of it. Yeah. I mean, it was something I was considering for a long time, and I was considering it before the pandemic started. So, what really ended up happening was impeachment started to take place in the House, and I didn't think it was an appropriate time to run an exploratory committee while impeachment was going on because I wasn't interested in being the guy running for president on an impeachment platform. And I was worried that that's how it would be perceived. I was very careful around that time actually to stay out of the spotlight. Even before the impeachment vote happened, there was the Mueller report. And I obviously wrote on Twitter, but I was actually very careful about not using it as a platform for politics. I didn't want to go on TV and look like I was using it to advance some kind of political agenda. So that actually slowed me down. I decided that it was not a good time to run for president. And then the pandemic started. And when the pandemic hit, I also thought that was not a good time to announce a presidential campaign for multiple reasons. One is that I have to care for my district. I've got to make sure that I am attentive to the district's needs. It's not about running a presidential campaign and thinking about national politics. I've got to think about the people of my district and make sure that they're being taken care of during that pandemic. And I also thought, what's a presidential campaign like during a pandemic? How does that even work? At some point, I decided I had to make a decision, and I thought, well, let's try an exploratory committee. Let's see what happens. You never know how things are going to play out until you try it. I tried it, and a lot of my concerns were confirmed. It was very difficult to get off the ground during a pandemic and during a highly polarized time as well.
About that first impeachment, something I've always
Mhm.
been curious about. You were granted some floor time by the Democrats to speak. How did that come
Yeah.
about, and what did that mean for you personally?
Well, I simply asked, and
Nancy
they
Pelosi?
granted. I think my office must have contacted one of the members of leadership on the Democratic side. Um, it's possible it was a committee chairman or the speaker's office, but
Hmm.
I asked and I was granted time, and I was, you know, it was an important moment. I thought that given that I was one of the first members of Congress to speak out on this issue and to say that I think the president's overstepped here and done something impeachable, I thought it was important to be on the floor, especially given that people were claiming it was a very partisan impeachment. And I wanted to show that there were people other than Democrats who thought that the president's conduct was totally improper. And even though a lot of my colleagues on the Republican side weren't willing to come out and do the same thing, I know that a lot of them behind the scenes felt the same way, felt at many times during President Trump's tenure that he had overstepped, he had done things that were improper. And I even had conversations where people thought the conduct was potentially impeachable, but the politics of it make it very hard for people to break from their party.
I want to get to that theatricality thing now. In a USA Today interview you gave last fall, you said a big problem with federal government was the theatrics. I don't know anyone who would disagree with you, but with the world the way it currently is, how do you possibly tamp down on that?
Well, one of the things you have to do is decentralize Congress. I've been talking about this a lot, and I don't think it gets enough airtime by the media or anyone else who's concerned about all of the dysfunction in our government and all of the theatrics. When you have a very centralized Congress where the Speaker of the House essentially controls the entire process, and I want to make this clear to people, members of the House of Representatives have not had the ability to freely amend legislation on the House floor since May 2016. So this didn't start under Nancy Pelosi, but it's continued under Nancy Pelosi. It started under Paul Ryan. And from the time I entered Congress in 2011 to now, you've seen a massive deterioration in deliberation on the House floor and the ability for members of Congress to participate. At this point, most members of Congress don't have anything to do other than theatrics. They don't actually have work in the way that people think they do. When you see the committee hearings, these hearings are largely staged. In other words, the members of Congress are literally given scripts and told, read the script. This is what you're going to say. They might not even know about the issue before they get in there, which is why you'll often see members in committee hearings who seem like they don't really know what's going on or are not asking questions of the witnesses because they've just been given a script to read and they actually don't want to engage with the witnesses because they don't even know how to respond if the witness says something. So you have almost like WWE wrestling. I mean, it's largely scripted in advance. It's theatrical because so much power is centralized that members of Congress actually don't participate in the legislative process. And because they know they don't have to participate in legislative process, they're not going to amend legislation, they're not going to ask real questions in committees. Well, why would they even bother to read the legislation? Why read legislation if you know you're not going to be able to participate anyways? So they just end up mailing it in. And the more centralized it is, the more centralized it becomes, and the more theatrical it becomes. So we could resolve this issue if the American people said, we're not going to accept a highly centralized Congress. We want our members of Congress to be able to participate. This wouldn't end all theatrics, of course. There would still be members of Congress who go on TV and make a big show of everything. But I think if you got members of Congress busy with the actual work of legislating, busy with the actual work of amending and deliberating, you would remove a lot of the incentive to spend their time on TV doing theatrics. They have nothing else to do right now.
Okay. I want to ask, when you were watching coverage of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, what was going through your head? You'd only been out of Congress for a few days.
I was horrified, absolutely horrified. I mean, I thought about, like, what if I were there? What would I do? And I thought about my friends. I was very concerned for them. I have lots of friends in Congress, and I thought about the staff who work there and the members of security who work there, the Capitol Police. I mean, before I had left Congress, I'd had a conversation with a Capitol Police officer. I'd always had very good relations with the Capitol Police. Obviously there were some failures that day, but many of them are, most of them are very committed servants and great people. And I'd had conversations with many of them over my time in Congress. And one of them I talked to just in the week before I left Congress, who said, hey, we're undermanned here. We don't have enough people, and it's a big problem. And that conversation haunts me now, because I was thinking more about, okay, well, they're working too many hours and all that. I wasn't thinking about an attack on the Capitol, like hundreds or however many people entering the Capitol
Mhm.
and actually attacking people and people dying.
Yeah.
When we think about security threats, we were generally thinking about one person at a time,
Mhm.
like 1, 2, 3 people or something like that. And probably Capitol Police were largely thinking that way as well. But Congress is going to have to change its protocols. But I would say this, and maybe you'll ask about it, but I don't think permanent fencing is a good idea. I don't think we should close down the Capitol to the public. It needs to be an open space for the people of this country. It's one of the most beautiful parts of this country that you can go into the U.S. Capitol and you don't have to be a member of Congress. You have a lot of access to our country's history and to our country's traditions and our institutions. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I don't want to see that taken away.
Well put. Do you think you'd still be in Congress if it wasn't for Donald Trump becoming president? If he'd never been president, would you still be in Congress today, do you think?
That's a tough one to answer. I never planned to serve beyond 10 or 12 years. And a lot of my colleagues knew this. I'd had conversations with them before Donald Trump became president. I had already talked to people about perhaps leaving the Republican Party and even perhaps not running for Congress, because I could see the breakdown of the institution. I'd seen how power was becoming centralized and we were becoming totally um, useless in a sense as legislators, at least in terms of our ability to legislate.
Is
You
that
could
why?
still use
Is that why?
the platform to speak out about issues, and that's helpful, of course, to use the platform to speak out about things. But I guess I'm a lawyer at heart in a sense. I went to Congress so I could actually read legislation and work on legislation and do things that will advance our country legislatively. I didn't go to Congress so I could just give speeches or go on television. And when that aspect of Congress was totally taken away, the ability to actually work on legislation, and I do mean totally taken away, members of Congress today cannot legislate. I think this is an urgent situation that people at home have to understand. In the House of Representatives, I can't speak for the Senate. I mean, we can see on TV it has its own problems.
Mhm.
But the House of Representatives does not allow members of Congress to legislate, and that is a big problem. And when that started to happen, I could see it coming in 2014, 2015, before Donald Trump was president. And like I said, in May 2016, they completely cut us off. They basically shut down in terms of our ability to amend things. They shut down the House of Representatives. So I started to think about my kids and my family and said, what am I doing here? Why am I here? And I used to actually get, very stressed out about it in conference meetings. I'd be sitting in a conference meeting and I could feel myself getting angry at times. Like, why am I doing this? I have a family at home and I'm here in Congress and we're not doing anything. We're not allowed to do anything. We're not allowed to deliberate and amend and debate. Why am I doing this? And so this was before Trump became president. I felt this way. And he, in a sense, accelerated it, because then you had a total breakdown. I mean, the people I thought I knew became totally different people.
Yeah.
So it was a tough last several years. And I don't know that I would have stayed even if Donald Trump had not become president. And I can tell you, if they don't fix the way the legislative process works, people are going to continue to feel this way. People who actually want to legislate are going to continue to feel this way. And the people you're going to attract to Congress are the people who are entertainers, who are actors. You're going to attract those people, and you're going to send away the people who actually want to legislate.
You answered my follow-up question about why you actually didn't run last year. I was always curious about that, and I think you just answered that pretty substantively. What do you think? There's not a whole lot to judge on yet. Impeachment, certifying an election, but what do you think so far? of your successor, Representative Meyer?
Well, so far I feel represented, and that's important. It's important that I feel like I have someone there who is willing to think critically and think independently. Now, there's a long ways to go, and I pray for him. I always wish him the best. It's a tough job. It's you face a lot of pressures there, and I communicate with him on a semi-regular basis. You know,
I was going
he's
to ask
not
that
shy.
too.
Yeah, he's not shy about reaching out if he feels like he'd like to get my opinion on something, and I think that's great. I think that's great. I want to have that communication because there are mistakes I made early on. There are things I've learned over the years that I can help him with. I can help guide him and at least give him my opinion, at least give him my view about what I think I might have done wrong or how I might do something better if I were still there. So, you know, I think that kind of communication is important, and it's a challenging job. The real test comes not on issues like impeachment. I've said this before. I think people think impeachment is the big test. When you vote on impeachment, about half of your district is going to like it, and half are not going to like it. So you will have a lot of support for it. If you look at a district like the third district, you've got at least 50% support for impeachment, in my opinion. So that's not the toughest vote. The tough votes are the ones where you have very little support for your position. And that's because most people aren't really familiar with the issue in the way that you are. They're not reading the legislation. It's not something as simple as some people storm the Capitol and are we going to impeach the president? It's something more nuanced and technical. And it's an emotionally charged issue. And then your principles really get tested. So those are the issues where going forward, he'll have to face those tests and we'll have to see how he comes out. But I'm very hopeful. You know, I think that he has integrity, and I think he's the kind of person who wants to do the right thing. So, you know, I'm always praying for him and hoping for the best.
Two-part question here, because you talk about mistakes you'd made. Yeah, you said when we were talking with Representative Meyer. Is there anything you're willing to share that you're particularly regretful about your time in Congress? And is there anything that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think that early on, I think, too tough on Obama in some ways. That's not to say that I, you know, agreed with him on a whole bunch of issues. I think I rightly disagreed with him on a whole bunch of things. But I regret contributing to some of that early
Talking
on.
about
And
gridlock?
yeah, I mean, it's not so much the gridlock because there are a lot of components to something like gridlock, right? Our system's designed to produce some sort of gridlock. You have separation of powers, and you have two bodies of that are in the legislative branch. So you're going to have some gridlock no matter what. But I think I was a little too quick to play into some of the hysteria early on, and that comes, you know, as you are in the job, you mature and you learn how to handle yourself better. And it's kind of funny because people say, "Oh, Justin, you were so tough on Trump." And when I look back, I was actually tougher on Obama in many ways. And uh, I can't imagine what I would have said about Trump 10 years ago. You know, but when I was a little more freewheeling with my criticisms. But I think that I learned that the things I'm striving for, which is to have a country that is free, depends so highly on trusting other people. You have to have a society where people trust each other and are willing to hear each other out. And if your rhetoric is so divisive or dismissive of the other side or other sides, you end up in this place where nobody is willing to listen to you and nobody's willing to trust you. And in fairness, I think I was much less partisan than, the vast majority of my colleagues, even early on. But even that level of partisanship, I think, was too much. It was too much. I thought the Republican Party was doing the right things a lot of times, and the Democratic Party was, trying to destroy the country. And that is the wrong way to look at it.
And rhetoric is one thing, but you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past. The Tea Party caucus and then the Freedom Caucus have taken a lot of criticisms as being two of the groups that really just brought everything to a grinding halt. They were called obstructionists. Looking back on it now, do you think there's any validity to that criticism?
Well, the Tea Party caucus was a thing in the House of Representatives. I wasn't really a part of the Tea Party caucus. There was a particular caucus called the Tea Party caucus.
You did come
I'm
in
not
that
sure.
wave, though.
Yeah, I came in with the Tea Party wave where there were a lot of so-called Tea Party representatives. I think it's hard to put them all together and say everyone was taking the same approach. Like, I really was about the policies. Again, I think I was too charged on, like Obama's the worst president and all this kind of stuff. So, that kind of rhetoric, I think, was not helpful. But in terms of partisanship, I tried to stay away from it even then compared to other people. I can't say that everyone, was careful. They were not all careful. When it came to the House Freedom Caucus, I think you're talking about a very different thing. The House Freedom Caucus today does not at all resemble the House Freedom Caucus that I helped found. The House Freedom Caucus I helped found was intentionally a group that was to stay away from the partisan politics. In fact, I wrote the mission statement for the House Freedom Caucus. And if you read the mission statement, it doesn't say anything about conservatism. It doesn't say anything about the Republican Party or partisanship. It's intentionally about opening up the House of Representatives and allowing people to participate in the legislative process. Now, when you are in Congress and you're trying to force participation in the process, you inevitably end up in this situation where you have clashes with leadership. So they might be trying to push a bill onto the floor that allows no amendments. And the way you try to stop it is by blocking the bill from going forward. And you say, well, look, we'll let it go if you allow us to participate. And I don't just mean conservatives or libertarians. I mean everyone, progressives, Democrats, everyone should be allowed to participate in the legislative process. And then the same leaders who are not allowing you to amend anything will say, oh, you are causing gridlock here by blocking this legislation. Well, no, they're the ones causing gridlock by not allowing anyone to participate in the legislative process other than an up or down vote on the final piece of legislation, which was crafted by them. So, I think you have to distinguish between the House Freedom Caucus, which was a small group starting out, and we were committed to opening up the process, and the Tea Party caucus or group of representatives, which was a much larger group and much more diverse and had a lot of different characters, some who were acting more properly and some who were acting much more improperly. Now, the House Freedom Caucus today is a very different creature than the House Freedom Caucus I started. So I make, I'm not going to defend the House Freedom Caucus of today.
Yeah.
I think that they basically lost their way. A lot of them are my friends, but I don't recognize them.
Okay.
I don't recognize them in terms of, at least if when we speak personally, we have fine relationships, but when I see what they're doing publicly, I don't recognize them.
As we wrap up here, you are still a young man. You clearly have a lot to say yet. Have you ruled out ever running for elected office again?
No, I haven't ruled that out. It's something I certainly consider, but the time has to be right. The mood has to be right. Right now, like if you talk about being in Congress, at least in the House of Representatives, there's not much functioning going on there. So let's suppose I went to Congress again. The only thing it would provide me is a platform, in terms of the legislative work, you can't really do it. So, and that's what I love about being a congressman. It's the legislative work. That's why I ran for office, so I could do that legislative work. And that's been gone for several years now, where we can't really do it. We can introduce legislation, but it's not moving anywhere. And the same will be true for, for Peter Meyer and for anyone else who's there, who's coming in. I certainly wish them the best. I hope that things work out. I hope that things can change and that they can introduce legislation and have it move and offer amendments and have them voted on. But I don't see that happening in the near future. If that can change, then certainly it's something I'd look at. And I wouldn't rule out running for any position. I don't rule out things in life. People have asked me this many times about running for president or running for this or that. I don't like to rule things out. I'll say I always keep an open mind, and I want to help advance liberty in this country.
I was about to say, professionally, what are you doing right now? I want to ask you at the beginning of this, what are you doing? You said spending time with family, which is great. Professionally, how are you spending your time, and is it involved in politics in any way?
So I'm working on a couple projects, and hopefully over the next couple months, I'll be able to talk more about that. But my goal right now is to try to educate the public from the outside. I tried it from the inside. I used the platform as a congressman to try to educate people, but actually it's a more difficult arena to educate people from your role as a member of Congress, because it gets so intertwined in the politics. In other words, you might be talking about how something might be improved within Congress, and people assume that you're talking about it for some partisan reason. They assume that you're talking about it because you're trying to make an excuse about a vote you've taken or whatever it might be. So I think talking about some of this stuff from the outside gives me an ability to talk about it more freely, more easily, without people having suspicions about motives. So I hope to do that. I want to get the public to understand what we've talked about today, which is Congress is broken. And I know that they think it's broken, but I don't think they recognize how broken it is. Your members of Congress in the House of Representatives cannot amend legislation. They cannot represent you the way they're supposed to. We functionally do not have a representative democracy. We have essentially an oligarchy, or I've called it a triumvirate before. The president, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, they basically run the place. They basically decide everything. And you are at home voting for parties, and then you're putting these leaders in charge, and it's basically three people deciding everything. And that's not the way our system was designed. And as long as you have that system, I mean, I could talk for hours about this. As long as you have that system, you will get so much of the dysfunction we see right now. You will get the theatrics in Congress. You'll have an overreaching executive. You will have members of Congress who don't read legislation. So we have to address that underlying problem. And that's what I want to focus on, getting people to see that.
Okay, last thing, and I'll let you go. And it is another possible future question. It's more of a request. From a fan of yours, I mentioned to a friend of mine the other day that I was going to be talking to you. And I'm not going to share his name, but suffice it to say, he is the biggest president of the Justin Amash fan club, and he is regretful that he never lived in your district to vote for you. And he said to me, please tell Justin, oh God, please run for governor in a few years. Please, God, Justin, run for governor. And I think there was one more oh God in there. What would you say to that person? Because that would get you out of the broken Washington. You'd be closer to family. What would you say to a fan of yours right now who wants you to take a look at Lansing?
Well, I'm not looking at it right now, so my apologies to this super fan. I do appreciate it. That's I'm flattered by it. But again, I don't rule anything out. But it's not something I'm looking at right now. I think that I'm focused on trying to educate people here from the outside, and I wouldn't rule out running for office again someday. But right now, I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing, and happy to be spending more time with my family.